Hello, I'm Anna Della Vega and welcome to episode 4 of Flute Reboot on IDAGIO Live, the place where classical music happens. This week we discover Frederik der Große of Prussia, the flute king, and the profound relationship with the first real flute virtuoso, Joachim Quantz. This relationship spanned 32 years and is responsible for hundreds of compositions, further developments in the mechanics of the flute, and generally greater popularity and importance of the instrument. No other royal throughout history has ever dedicated themselves to any instrument as Frederik II of Prussia did with the flute. It really was a true love affair. And when you, of course, have one of the most important kings in Europe playing the flute, composing for the flute, entertaining people with the flute, this has an enormous resonance. And Quantz was by his side, facilitating and supporting this until his death. Joachim Quantz was an exceptional flautist and met the crowned young Prince Frederik in Berlin during one of his European tours. The Queen had allowed Prince Frederik to have flute lessons at the great dismay of her husband, King Frederick William I of Prussia. In fact, the story goes that Quantz had to hide on a couple of occasions in the cupboard to escape the outrages of the king, appalled that his son was learning the flute. So at this time, Quantz was actually living in the court of Dresden when they met and traveling to Berlin back and forwards on the request of Frederik's mother. It wasn't until Frederik became king that Quantz was finally employed in the court of Berlin and came to live with him. So about Quantz, really we can say there is no one character for any instrument through history who is so fundamental as Quantz was to the flute. He is, for the flute, what Paganini and Stradivari are combined for the violin. So Paganini was composer and virtuoso, Stradivari breaking boundaries on instrument making. So Quantz played all three roles for the flute. I mean, of course, with Stradivari, the case is different because the violin and the revolutions he made in the quality of the instrument is still valid today. Whereas since the flute that Quantz developed and the evolutions that he made, the flute has gone through many, many different changes since then. We don't play the Quantz flute anymore. But as a side, this is actually amazing to think at this time in the middle of the 1700s, the violin was finished in its final form since 100 years, yet the flute had miles and miles and miles to go before it reaches its final form. So the one-keyed flute, which we've talked about in previous episodes, Quantz is attributed to adding a second key on the foot joint, which vastly improved the tuning. But more importantly, he made a sliding head joint, which I'm going to show you on the modern flute because it's still, this revolution is still part of the modern flute. So this is the sliding head joint. But when you put it in, there's so much movement, you can actually change the tuning by a semitone either way. And the cork, this screw with a cork on it, can also adjust the tuning. So this was absolutely revolutionary and made an enormous difference. Quantz wrote 200 sonatas and 300 concertos for the flute. He was known as the finest flautist in Europe. But most importantly, he wrote a treatise, which was called On Playing the Flute, which is the valuable source of performance practice in flute technique of the 18th century. In addition to the one by Jacques Hotteterre, which I've also discussed, the difference being, though, very importantly, that Hotteterre really focused on the French school and spent most of his life in France. But Quantz traveled so much, so he combines the Italian, the French, and the German styles into what he coined and termed mixed style, which is relevant to performers of any instrument today. It's a real window into performance practices of the 18th century. And just in this treatise, I actually read that, believe it or not, some years ago, a 300-page treatise full of, technical terms and so, but there was one quote within that that really defined and changed my musical journey, and that was, that which does not come from the heart does not easily reach the heart. And I've carried that with me in my back pocket ever since. It's like when the fear of stage fright, which can come upon us all, or the fear of judgment is there, it's one can always return to this idea that you can't speak to another heart if the mind and the ego is in the way. So that, okay, Quantz. Now I am going to show you actually the flutes and the development that we have. Okay, so here we have Quantz on the left, and this is a portrait of King Frederik, who, that's actually the only portrait that he ever sat for in person. So now we have the flutes. The brown one is the one-keyed flute we discussed last time, and the black one is, you see here, the extra key, which is actually no longer part of the modern flute, but that's the development he made, which was really fundamental at that time. And now a beautiful painting. That is King Frederik performing for his guests. Okay, so now to Frederik the Great. He is such a fascinating character. He ruled for a really long time, 46 years. So that's like ruling 10 years more than Mozart lived. It's amazing. He made it possible for men not of noble status to become judges and senior bureaucrats. He encouraged immigrants of different nationalities and religions to come to Prussia. He supported the arts, very much so, and he allowed complete freedom of press and literature. So he was a really amazing leader. Most biographers agreed he much preferred men to women, and that his sexual orientation was really central to his life, which I will talk about more in a moment. Back to him as a young prince. Now, his father, King Frederick William, was nicknamed the Soldier King, and he had a very powerful army led by the famous Potsdam Giants, which sounds like a bit of a basketball team to me, but he had a violent temper, as we saw with Quantz, like, and the cupboard situation, and he ruled with absolute authority. Now, his son Frederik loved music, literature, French culture, which clashed with his father's militarism. Apparently, the young Frederik was beaten and often humiliated. So, rather distressed at his son's artistic frivolities, King William began a search for a tutor, but he looked for a soldier rather than an academic, and he chose Jacques Duhan, who had impressed greatly on the battlefield. But what he didn't know was that Duhan was in fact a passionate scholar, and the king had requested that there should be no studies of poetry or philosophy or ancient history, but Duhan was all for it, and together with Frederik, Duhan built a 3,000 volume secret library of poetry and Greek and Roman classics and French philosophy. I mean, can you imagine a house that could hide a library of 3,000 books? It's incredible. Now, when he was 18, Frederik tried to flee to England with a Prussian officer, Hans Hermann von Katte, who he was supposedly in love with. Now, it failed, and Frederik and Katte were arrested and imprisoned for treason by Frederik's father. His father threatened him momentarily with execution, and then instead decided that he shall be forced to renounce his succession to the throne. In the end, the king finally settled for making Frederik watch the beheading of his friend Katte. The library was subsequently discovered, the 3,000 book library, and Duhan, the tutor, was banished and exiled to a tower in the Baltic coast, and Frederik was imprisoned for a year. So it was all rather grim times. Finally, Frederik was granted royal pardon, but the really rigorous schooling began, like statecraft, administration, war, all the things his father really cared about. He was forced to marry a woman, of course, Elizabeth Christine of the Austrian Habsburgs. But then his father died in 1740, and of course, much changed. He became king. He immediately separated from his wife and moved to the summer palace, Sanssouci, in Potsdam, and visited her once a year on her birthday for the rest of his life. And of course, he hired Quantz and got big time into the flute. King Frederik composed 121 sonatas for the flute. He played, of course. Next to him, Quantz composed 296 flute concertos on his request. So there's enormous amounts of repertoire with these two combined. Now I'm going to play for you a snippet of a Frederik the Great composition, followed by a little bit of Quantz. Okay. So, and now a little bit of Quantz, which is incredibly technically challenging, unbelievable. Here's Quantz. So most of Quantz's compositions have actually remained unpublished, which is a bit of a disaster for me, having discovered that, because I have a bit of a passion for getting into dust in far off libraries and pulling out manuscripts. So there goes my summer knowing there's 250 Quantz concertos up for grabs. As a flute player, we will actually never really know how good Frederik was. In those days, everyone generally praised the king, no matter what he did. But I did read something that said Frederik the Great is said to have played the instrument respectively. His execution of slow movements was highly praised, but in fast movements, he is said to have taken undue liberties with the tempo, which is typical of an amateur. We're all like that as youngsters, racing through the easy bit and then putting on the brakes for the hard bit and then racing off again. But nonetheless, his love for the flute was all-encompassing, and together with Quantz's work, Sanssouci really was a worship ground for the flute. Now, it's important to add that one imagines Frederik the Great more in the model of the French kings of Versailles, but it's important to say he disapproved of luxury and extravagance of the French royal court. His own court remained quite Spartan. It was frugal and rather small and restricted to a very limited court amount of close circle friends. Another factor to note is that Frederik actually in the end was very successful as a leader in war, contrary to what his father may have predicted. He enlarged Prussia's territories. He made Prussia the most important military power in Europe. And he actually won the 7-year wars against all odds. So how did this all end? After the 7 Years' War finished in 1763, it is said that Frederik's breath control had weakened, he'd lost teeth, his gout had worsened, and he was forced to stop playing. And it said that this was a really defining moment in his life, and he proclaimed, he said that I have lost my best friend. And the decline of his capability to perform actually coincided with a decline in an interest for music at all. Quantz died in Potsdam, age 77, of a stroke. And I'll just read you something from the Berliner Zeitung of this day. It says, his excellent talent in composition, his felicitous efforts to perfect the flute, his moving way of playing it, which he sustained up to the end of his life, make him immortal for all posterity. Frederik outlived Quantz by 12 years, but it was really a 12 years less filled with music, and he died in 1786, also in Sanssouci. Now, after his death, there were two further episodes, so to say, in his story. About 150 years after he died, he procured himself quite an admirer. The Nazis glorified him, and Adolf Hitler personally idolized him, and he became one of the Nazi symbols. So associations with him since World War II have, of course, become rather unfavorable. And it was not really until the last 20 years that, again, historians have started to celebrate him as one of the finest generals of the 18th century, one of the most enlightened monarchs of his age, and highly successful, even you know, in enabling Prussia to succeed in against the Austrian Habsburgs for control of the Germanic peoples. Another bad luck was, after his death, was as follows. He asked to be buried next to his greyhounds on the vineyard terraces at Sanssouci. But his nephew and successor ordered instead that the body be buried next to his father in a church in Potsdam. At the end, well, towards the end of the World War II, Hitler dug him up and ordered the coffin to be hidden in a salt mine, supposedly for protection from destruction. At the end of the war in 1946, the United States Army then relocated him to Marburg. And then again in 1953, the coffin was moved again, along with his father, to Burg Hohenzollern. And it was not until after the German reunification, on the 205th anniversary of his death, to the day, on 17th of August in 1991, that Frederik's body coffin covered by a Prussian flag was escorted by the Bundeswehr, the Guard of Honor, at nightfall in Sanssouci, and he was buried with his dogs in the garden where he had requested in accordance with his will. So that's it for the beautiful and really fascinating story of these two men, and this great love for the flute there at Sanssouci. And just to end on a lighter note, it was said that Quantz actually was really demanding and very rigorous in his teaching of the flute with King Frederik. And one of the other court composers was actually the son of Johann Sebastian Bach, C.P. Bach. And there's a joke, he made a joke that goes as follows: which is the most frightening beast in the world? And the answer is the lapdog of Mrs. Quantz. It is so terrifying that it scares Mrs. Quantz. But Mr. Quantz is scared of her. Yet he himself is feared by the greatest monarch on this earth. So, so that's it. Thank you for joining me on Adagio Live. We have not yet been to Italy and looked at that other great epicenter of classical music at this time. So next week, join me for Vivaldi's Venetian Orphanage and the world's first female orchestra. I'm Anna de la Vega. Take care and thank you.